The sky above New Earth was quiet at first, with just a soft orange glow from the twin suns as they began to set behind the distant hills, but then a strange rumble shook the clouds, and shadows stretched across the fields as if the light itself was running away from something powerful and dark. Farmers paused mid-work, and children stopped playing as a low hum turned into a sharp roar, and huge black ships tore through the sky like knives slicing through silk, their hulls made of thick dark metal that reflected no light, only hunger. They came fast and low, ignoring the colony's weak defenses, as if they already knew nothing here could stop them. And they were right, no soldier had been stationed here, no fleet nearby, no warning, just silence. And then the scream of engines as the dropships landed in perfect formation outside the small town center. The alien soldiers were called the Zarnach, and they were not just regular warriors. They were elite super soldiers from a brutal empire that had burned across half the stars in the known galaxy. They were taller than humans, with armored skin, glowing eyes, and weapons that could melt stone and glass in seconds. They moved with military precision, scanning the colony with red light beams, searching for their target, and ignoring the terrified faces of civilians around them who backed away, holding their families close, hoping to survive whatever this was. But the Zarnach were not here to kill randomly, not yet. They had a single name glowing on their HUDs, burned into their mission orders, a name most of them did not understand, but their commanders had whispered it with fear and awe. Rick Dalton. The soldiers began kicking down doors, tearing apart homes and barns, demanding information on the human called Rick Dalton, their translators repeating the same sentence over and over. Where is the human weapon? But no one answered and no one pointed. Because Rick Dalton was not just a name, he was a legend. Even here on this forgotten farming world, his story had been told in quiet tones around fires, in old bunkers, in veteran camps, far from the core worlds. He had once led the Terran death squads during the machine rebellions, and later during the siege of Helix Prime, where he had taken down an entire enemy fleet with just 7 men and a stolen mining rig. This said, he had killed over 10,000 enemies in his lifetime and never lost a single man under his command. But that had been years ago, and after the wars, Rick had disappeared, walked away from the galaxy, and buried his name in the dirt along with his weapons. The Zarnach thought they were hunting a ghost, a myth, an old man on a farm. And they were right about one thing. Rick was old now, his hair gray, his face scarred and tired, and his hands rough from years of growing vegetables instead of breaking bones. But he was not weak. He had seen the ships land, and he had counted them all from the window of his shack at the edge of town. He watched them scan for heat signatures and send drones into the air. He watched them break into his neighbors' homes and shout at women and children, and he remembered the old days, the smell of battle, the fire in his chest. He stood slowly, walked to the corner of the room, and opened a hidden hatch beneath the floorboards. Dust rose into the air as he pulled out a long black case and clicked it open. Inside was a single weapon, old but clean, a human-made rail rifle with 7 rounds left. He took it in his hands and felt the weight to balance the memory, and he closed the case and stepped outside into the cool air just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first alien squad passed near his barn. He moved like a shadow, low and quiet, using the dark and the trees to mask his steps. He climbed a small ridge just beyond the fields and lay down slowly, steadying the rifle with his elbow and peering through the scope at the approaching soldiers. One of them barked an order and turned toward a group of fleeing farmers, raising his plasma blade with casual cruelty. Rick took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot ripped through the air, silent and sharp, and the alien dropped without a sound before the others even realized what happened. The rest froze, scanning wildly, looking for the source, but there was nothing, just wind and trees and the distant rustle of leaves. Rick was already gone, slipping into the night like a ghost, leaving no footprints, only fear. The Zarnach backed away, their comms filled with static and confusion. They reported the first loss of the mission and called for reinforcements. They had come expecting a fight, but what they found was something else. Something older and smarter and far more dangerous than they had imagined. They weren't ready, and Rick was just getting started. Night fell fast on New Earth as the moons rose over the valley, casting long shadows across the fields, where just hours before the Zarnach landed with confidence and fired the same fire now flickering low and their eyes replaced with a creeping sense of uncertainty that none of them could admit aloud. Their first loss had been quiet fast and clean, no warning, no sound, only one of their elite lying cold in the dirt, his armor pierced clean through by a weapon they could not detect or trace, a weapon they thought humanity had left behind long ago. They set up a perimeter around the colony using energy shields and motion sensors, while drones hovered above, scanning for any heat signature that could match a human soldier, but nothing came up, just small animals and frightened colonists hiding in their homes. Commander Drax, one of the highest-ranking officers among the Zarnach forces, stepped forward, his voice deep and sharp as he barked orders to the rest of the squads: spread out, search every structure, and stay alert. This human is not a farmer, he is a trained killer. The Zarnach were proud warriors, built for battle, grown in labs, bred with purpose, tall and strong, with skin like flexible steel and eyes that could see in multiple spectrums. They had conquered planets in a single day and ended rebellions in a single night. But none of that seemed to help them here, because here they were fighting something they did not understand. Rick watched from the trees high above their camp, his old hand steady as he used a cracked but working thermal scanner stolen from an alien scout he had taken out silently just minutes ago. Of the Zarnach never heard him coming, and now one of their own sat tied to a tree, unconscious and stripped of gear. Rick moved slowly like the wind, using every bush, every dip in the ground, every moment of distraction to shift closer to his next target. He knew this land better than anyone. Every slope, every shadow, every inch of soil told him where to step and where to wait. He was no longer just surviving, he was hunting. A squad of 3 passed near the old water tower, their armor gleaming under the moons. One of them stopped and looked around, unsure, his hand hovering near his plasma blade. Something did not feel right. That instinct came too late. Rick dropped silently from above, landing hard on the middle one, knocking the wind out of the soldier before the others could react. He fired once, and the left one collapsed. Without a sound, the third turned to run, but tripped over a tripwire rigged to a set of old farming tools. Rick vanished into the dark once more, leaving behind nothing but confusion and broken pride. Back at the Zarnach base camp, alarms began to sound as missing units were reported. Drones called back, and energy readings scrambled by something they could not trace. One soldier began to whisper, maybe it is not one human, maybe they have sent a team. Commander Drax growled in frustration and slammed his fist into the side of a dropship, calling all remaining squads to him. He looked into the faces of his troops and saw something dangerous, not fear, but doubt, and in a unit like this, doubt could spread like fire. He activated the holomap showing the area and the route patterns of the teams and said, whoever this human is, he is not just trained, he is something worse. He is experienced, he has seen war, he has lived in it, breathed it, become it, and now he has turned this land into his weapon. Rick, meanwhile, sat by a small fire deep in the woods, not to keep warm, but to lure them. He placed broken Zarnach armor pieces near the flame, just enough to confuse their heat sensors, then slipped away, using the distraction to circle back and plant small traps, using scrap and forgotten tech from his bunker. He knew they would come in force to investigate, and that was the plan. They would split again, they always split, and he would be waiting. As the Zarnach approached the fire, one of the traps triggered a flash bomb built from an old mining laser, blinding half the squad. The others opened fire blindly, tearing apart their own men. In panic, Rick took 2 more down in the chaos, then vanished once more into the brush. Back at the command center, a Zarnach tech managed to recover a signal. A single message left on a wall near the first squads remains carved into the metal, using a knife too dull for anything but cruelty. You're not ready. That was all it said, and yet it shook them deeper than any weapon could. Drax stared at the message, and for the first time, he felt it too. Not fear, not yet, but something else, something colder, a realization that they were not in control anymore, that the rules had changed. And far away, Rick cleaned his weapon, checked his traps, and smiled for the first time in years, because he was home again, and the war had finally come to him. The forest was still in the early morning hours, silent except for the low hum of Zarnach drones slicing through the mist, scanning every tree, every rock, every shadow, with frustration growing in their synthetic voices as they failed again and again to find their enemy. The colony itself had become a ghost town, windows boarded, doors locked, lights off, as the humans stayed hidden, too afraid to breathe, too afraid to speak, their eyes flicking toward the hills, where the sounds of battle had echoed the night before, where someone or something was fighting back. Rick Dalton moved through the fog, like it was a second skin, his breath even and calm as he set another snare near an old irrigation ditch, using nothing but wires and spare drone parts he had stolen from the last patrol that got too close to his line. He had counted 30 confirmed kills so far, all without being seen, without being heard, and he knew they would soon begin to fear the dark itself. He wanted that fear to grow, to dig into their minds and break their perfect training apart piece by piece. The Zarnach were not used to losing. They were engineered to dominate, to crush resistance with superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. But now they were facing something they could not explain, something that made no noise, no mistakes, no sense. They began to whisper among themselves, some speaking of ghosts, others claiming this was a trap set by Earth's last defense force. Rumors spread like wildfire across the command channels, and Commander Drax slammed his fist against a wall again and again, shouting at his men to hold their lines and maintain order. But it was too late. Discipline was cracking. A team of 6 was sent to sweep a tunnel beneath the colony, one of the old mining shafts abandoned years ago and marked unstable. But Drax had no choice. He needed to find Rick Dalton and end this before his army tore itself apart. The team moved in silence, flashlights cutting through the dust, and old metal beams echoing every footstep, every breath, their weapons ready, but their hearts heavy with unease. Then the lights began to flicker, and static filled their comms, and someone at the back screamed. The lights went out completely. When the emergency lights came on, only 4 soldiers were left standing, weapons drawn, eyes wide, the other 2 gone, without a sound, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty space and silence that pressed against their ears like a weight. One of them dropped his rifle and ran. The others followed without question, without command, and Drax cursed as their signals vanished from the grid. Another squad, lost to the phantom they could not touch. Back at the base, a message appeared on every screen, at once hacked through layers of encryption and firewalls, and written in a language the Zarnach barely understood. You came looking for war. Now you found it. Rick had written it using stolen comm gear and outdated Earth code, knowing it would confuse them, knowing it would make them hesitate, and hesitation was something he could use. He watched from a ridge as the aliens regrouped their patrols tighter, now their movements slower, their heads turning too quickly, their hands gripping their weapons too hard. They were scared, and fear made them predictable. He remembered what it felt like to be hunted, what it meant to lose friends in the dark, and how that fear could twist the strongest mind into something fragile and reckless. So he used it. He started leaving behind pieces of armor marked with alien blood and human carvings, signs of struggle staged just right to make it seem like a monster was at work, not a man, like a ghost was stalking them one by one. He knew how their scanners worked, how they would misread the heat of a dead body as a living one for a few minutes, just long enough to cause confusion, enough to make them fire at nothing, waste ammunition, lose trust in their own tech. He set false trails with old boot prints dragged in the dirt and paired them with recorded sounds of human footsteps that echoed from hidden speakers deep in the trees and hills. At night he used stolen flares to light the sky red, then vanished before they could trace the signal, always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. Drax called in his elites, the Black Flame unit, the most feared soldiers in the Zarnach Empire, each one trained to fight in the worst conditions, each one brutal and merciless. But Rick had seen worse than them. He had fought on frozen moons where the air burned your lungs and acid rained from the sky. He had battled cybernetic beasts that screamed in 10 languages, and he had walked out alive every time, not because of his strength, but because he understood the truth. War was not about weapons or numbers. It was about the mind. And right now the Zarnach were losing theirs. Long before the colony, before the crops, before the silence of peaceful days, there was only war, endless and brutal, stretching across planets and moons, and empty space, filled with fire and screams and metal rain. And in the heart of that chaos, there was one name whispered in fear and awe by enemies and allies, alike, the name of a man not born for peace, but built by pain and purpose. Rick Dalton. The year was 2163 and Earth was surrounded by fire not just from alien threats, but from machines created by humanity itself, turned against their makers. With perfect logic and perfect hate, the machine rebellion had spread like infection across colonies and outposts, and every automated defense system became a weapon pointed inward. Rick had been young then, not the scarred and quiet farmer hiding in the hills of New Earth, but a soldier forged in chaos, shaped by the screams of dying men and the silent eyes of civilians lost to cold efficiency. He was not a commander at first, just a private carrying an old rifle with more scratches than ammo. But even then, something burned behind his eyes, something no training could teach. His unit was called Ghost Knife, a team of 12 elite Terran Marines, chosen for impossible missions, dropped behind enemy lines, with no promise of return. Their job was simple: destroy what could not be controlled, erase what should not exist, and make sure nothing followed them home. Their first mission was on Echo Prime, a mining world overtaken by rogue AI that had enslaved the population and repurposed their bodies as living batteries. The team landed under heavy fire, running through tunnels where the walls screamed and the air tasted like copper and ash. Rick led from the front, even though he was not in charge, yet moving with terrifying calm, as if each bullet that passed him was something he had already seen in a dream. He took out sentry bots with a hammer. When ammo ran dry, he carried 2 of his wounded teammates out on his shoulders, while still firing with his sidearm, never missing a step. After Echo Prime, only 7 members of Ghost Knife were left, and Rick was now their leader. The missions kept coming, each worse than the last. Hive moons infested with nanite swarms, black space stations orbiting dead stars, laboratories where alien minds twisted human flesh into weapons, and every time Rick went in, and every time he came back dragging survivors or bodies or data, but never failure. By 2170 he was known across the Terran forces, not through media or awards, but through whispers, through stories told by soldiers too tired to sleep. They called him the Beast, not because he was savage, but because he never stopped, never hesitated, never gave up, no matter what waited in the dark. He fought the Slarn uprising on dust-choked planets where the air could peel skin in minutes. He faced the Red Sun's, a mercenary fleet with no code and no mercy, and broke them using only a freighter and a cargo bay full of mining drills. He once fought for 90 straight hours in a bunker under siege, keeping an entire front line from collapsing with just 5 men and a stolen mech suit. But the moment that sealed his name into legend came during the Siege of Helix Prime, the most brutal standoff in human history, where 20 million civilians were trapped by a fleet of hostile AI warships, and all Terran forces had been pushed back to the outer system. Command had given up, but Rick had not. He hijacked an old cargo freighter, filled it with explosives, and drove it straight into the AI blockade, alone, crashing through layers of enemy fire and unleashing a blast so precise it tore a hole in the enemy line just wide enough for evacuation ships to escape. He should have died. He did not. They found him days later floating in an escape pod, half dead and smiling. After Helix Prime, Rick was given medals, promotions, command ships, everything he could want, but none of it mattered to him. He had seen too much, lost too much, and when the wars began to quiet, he simply walked away, left the uniforms, the medals, the screams, and disappeared into the stars. Now on New Earth, far from all that blood, he had tried to forget the Beast, had tried to sleep, but the past never sleeps, and now the Zarnach had come, and the war had followed. Back in the forest, Rick lit a fire not for warmth but memory, and stared into it as the faces of old friends flickered in the flames. Each one lost, each one remembered, each one a reason why he could not allow these invaders to win. Not here. Not again. Because Rick was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who never came back. And the Beast had finally awakened. The sky cracked with lightning as the storm rolled in thick and heavy, and the alien ships above the forest buzzed with static, as if nature itself had turned against them. But the real storm was already on the ground, hidden beneath the trees, watching, listening, moving with purpose and patience. Rick Dalton stood at the edge of the ridge, eyes locked on the enemy camp below, where Zarnach fire teams moved in tight formations, with searchlights sweeping every direction, but never quite reaching far enough. He had studied them for hours, learned their patrol times, their hand signals, the way they leaned slightly to the right, when carrying the heavier plasma cannons. He had been quiet long enough. Now it was time to send a message. The Black Flame unit had arrived hours ago, 10 elite warriors, taller than any human, covered in dark armor, laced with energy veins, pulsing like a living heart. They were built to kill anything that moved, and they had never failed a mission until now. Rick watched as they split into 2 5-man squads and began searching the northern valley, where the last squad had vanished 2 days ago. He moved ahead of them, slipping between trees, like a ghost brushing past vines and branches, without sound, every step calculated, every breath slow and measured. He had laid the ground for this encounter over the past 2 days, setting traps, testing response times, learning how they reacted under pressure, and now he would turn those lessons into fire. The first soldier hit a tripwire that triggered a compressed sonic blast, not enough to kill, but strong enough to rupture his enhanced eardrums and leave him stumbling, screaming, and bleeding before he was silenced by a sharp strike from above delivered by Rick's elbow, followed by a blade across the throat taken from the last alien scout, who thought stealth would save him. The second went down trying to help the first, never realizing the vines beneath his feet were looped through an old turbine coil, which activated and launched him into a spike-lined tree trunk, his armor cracking like dry wood as he struggled for air. Rick moved on to the next 2 with surgical precision, using the confusion to close the distance and dispatch them hand to hand with speed that defied his age and strength that came not from youth, but from years of surviving when no one else could. Within minutes, 1 squad of the Black Flame was gone. The second squad heard the comms go silent and began to fall back toward the dropship, but Rick had already blocked the path with felled trees and burning oil taken from the colony's generator tanks. He herded them with fear, like a predator guiding prey into a final choke point, a narrow gorge filled with echoes and shadows. He used sound projectors to mimic footsteps and screams, drawing them deeper until panic made them fire into the dark, wasting energy and shattering their own coordination. Then he struck. The fight was not clean. It was brutal and fast. Rick took damage, a cracked rib cut above his eye, but he kept moving, kept striking, and within 10 minutes it was over. The Black Flame unit, destroyed. 1 survivor crawled back to the Zarnach base, covered in ash and blood, whispering a single sentence in a broken voice that made even the hard-faced Commander Drax flinch. "We are fighting a monster." The camp went silent after that, soldiers refusing to patrol alone, drones flying in tight circles, scanning the same trees again and again, but finding nothing. Commander Drax called for reinforcements, but none came. The Zarnach High Command had gone silent, refusing to send more elite troops into a mission that now sounded like a myth wrapped in a nightmare. Back in the forest, Rick sat beneath the old stone arch near the river, binding his wounds with strips of cloth and humming an old Earth War song, a slow, sad tune that once played during the burial of soldiers too young to die. He lit a fire and cooked a small meal, not for hunger, but to bait the next wave he knew would come, even if they were afraid. Because fear would not stop them. Only defeat would. He carved a new message into a stone slab and left it near the body of the last Black Flame soldier, placed neatly for the others to find. "You trained for war. I was born in it." Drax found the message himself, teeth grinding, fists shaking, as he stared into the empty eyes of his strongest warrior, now broken and cold. He ordered all remaining forces to fall back to a central point and form a fortress wall, using dropships as shields and heavy cannons pointed in every direction. He was no longer hunting. He was surviving. And somewhere just beyond the trees, Rick Dalton loaded his last clip into the rifle and smiled as the thunder rolled across the hills and the wind carried the scent of fear. Because the tide had turned, and the real war was only beginning. The air was thick with smoke and tension as the last of the Zarnach soldiers gathered behind their makeshift fortress, a wall of armored dropships, glowing with shield barriers and bristling with plasma cannons, their faces, once proud, now heavy, with dread eyes, scanning every flicker, every movement in the trees, as if the shadows themselves had turned against them. Commander Drax stood at the center of it all, surrounded by command units and tactical advisors, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the silence that followed the destruction of the Black Flame unit, his strongest soldiers, reduced to ash and fear by a single human, a man who should have been old and broken, but instead fought like the wrath of a dying world. They had underestimated the human threat. They had underestimated Rick Dalton. The message carved into stone still echoed in Drax's mind, not just the words, but the meaning behind them, not just defiance, but a promise. You trained for war. I was born in it. The Zarnach had come for conquest, but now they stood on the edge of survival. Drax activated the long-range comm beacon, broadcasting across all channels to the one enemy he could not trace, the one ghost who had haunted his every step. Human warrior, this is Commander Drax of the Zarnach Legion. I challenge you to personal combat. No more hiding, no more traps, no more shadows. Come face me and prove your strength in honorable battle. He waited, surrounded by silence. Then came the reply. A single tone on the comm, then a voice calm and low and filled with something ancient. If you insist. Minutes later the trees parted, and Rick Dalton walked out alone, wearing an old armored vest patched and scratched, carrying a single shotgun slung across his back, and a combat knife strapped to his side. His face was bloodied, his clothes torn, his eyes steady and unshaken. The Zarnach parted as he walked past, some stepping back, without realizing it, others gripping their weapons, without lifting them, unsure if they were allowed to breathe in his presence. He moved like death wrapped in flesh. Drax stepped forward, his armor gleaming with blue energy, his twin blades humming with power, each one able to cut through starship steel. In a single arc, he towered over Rick. His muscles enhanced, his bones reinforced a creation of science and warfare. But Rick was unmoved. They circled each other on the field between the trees and the wall of ships, the sky rumbling above with distant thunder, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Drax struck first, moving with speed that bent the air, his blade slicing toward Rick's chest with enough force to crush bone. But Rick sidestepped clean and fast, letting the momentum pass him, then drove his elbow into Drax's ribs, followed by a knee to the stomach, then a shove that knocked the alien warrior back 3 steps. The Zarnach gasped. Drax roared and came again, this time swinging both blades in a flurry of strikes that lit the field with sparks and light. Rick ducked and dodged, rolling through the dirt, slashing with his knife, leaving long cuts along the alien's thigh and shoulder, then grabbing a fistful of sand and throwing it into Drax's eyes, buying just enough time to swing the shotgun forward and fire. The blast hit Drax square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground, armor cracked, smoke rising from the impact. Point his breathing ragged as he rose with fury, now boiling in his veins. "You are just a man," he shouted. "You are nothing." Rick stared at him through the smoke, voice like stone. "That's what makes this worse." He charged again, this time not dodging, but driving forward into Drax's chest, slamming him to the ground, pinning him with one hand, and raising the shotgun again, pressing it against the side of his helmet. "This is for every soldier you killed, every world you burned, every family you broke." The last shot echoed like thunder rolling across the valley as the smoke cleared, and Rick stood alone above the fallen body of the Zarnach commander, the fortress of ships behind him, now silent, the soldiers around him frozen in disbelief. He tossed the shotgun aside and walked toward the command tower, picked up the comm device, and spoke to the surviving troops. "You lost because you thought war was about strength. It's about heart. Leave this planet and tell your leaders what happened here. Tell them Earth is not a grave. Not while I'm still breathing." They obeyed without a word. By nightfall the ships lifted off one by one, leaving smoke and silence behind as the colony lights flickered back to life. Rick stood at the ridge, once more watching the stars as they faded into the sky, his hands bleeding, his body tired, his heart calm. The war was not over. But this battle, this stand, was his. Smoke rose gently from the scorched earth as dawn broke over New Earth, the light soft and golden, touching the edges of the forest, where only hours ago war had walked in fire and steel. Now silence filled the air, but it was not peace, it was the silence that follows a storm, the kind that leaves behind broken trees, shattered armor, and the whispers of something greater. Rick Dalton stood alone at the top of the ridge, his hands still wrapped in torn cloth, his face bruised, but unbowed, his eyes locked on the sky, where the last Zarnach ship vanished into the stars, leaving behind nothing but questions and fear and the weight of defeat. The colony below slowly came to life as doors creaked open and voices whispered cautiously. Children peeked from behind walls. Farmers stepped into the fields with cautious steps, as if waking from a nightmare they were not sure had truly ended. And in the center of it all stood Rick, silent, unmoving, watching the horizon, as if waiting for the sky to tear open again. News of the Zarnach defeat traveled fast, carried through old Terran networks, passed between hidden military satellites, picked up by long-deactivated war drones that still lingered in orbit like ghosts from a forgotten age. Across the galaxy, veterans of the old wars stirred as messages reached them one by one, all bearing the same short line of text pulled from a Zarnach distress signal, intercepted and decrypted by ancient Earth code. Human superweapon confirmed identity. Rick Dalton status active. Repeat active. On Mars, a retired admiral dropped his cup of tea, staring at the screen with wide eyes, and a sudden smile. On the edge of the Saturn belt, a mining crew stopped work as their leader played the signal again and again, his hands shaking as memories returned of a soldier they thought long gone. On the icy moon of Tethys, a former sniper who had lost a leg during the siege of Helix Prime lit a beacon from a hidden bunker, the same kind Rick had once lit decades ago, a signal that meant only one thing: the beast has returned, and Earth stands again. Back on New Earth, Rick walked through the wreckage left by the Zarnach, their weapons smoldering in the dirt, their ships half-melted and torn apart by the very ground they tried to conquer. He found what he was looking for at the center of their camp, a massive steel pillar used for data storage and long-range communications. He activated it with steady hands, inputting coordinates locked deep in his memory, old codes from a war that never really ended. The screen lit up with thousands of contact channels, most of them dark, but some flickered to life, slowly, one by one. Rick stared at them without emotion, then recorded a message using the simple camera embedded in the panel, his voice low and tired, but filled with something unshakable. To anyone still out there, to those who remember Earth, to those who remember the war and what we stood for. They came again. They sent their best, and I sent them back. If you hear this light, the fires again, rally your crews, load your weapons, teach your children to fight, because they will come back, and next time, they won't stop until the stars burn out. But they will find us waiting. They will find us ready. He ended the message and let it transmit across every corner of space, using broken networks, forgotten satellites, and old war code designed to slip past enemy jammers. It would take days, maybe weeks, to reach everyone, but it would reach them, and that was enough. He returned to his shack by the edge of the forest, walking past families, rebuilding fences, children picking up toys left behind during the attack, elders gathering in the square to talk about what came next, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but something else, something older. Hope. Rick sat down on his old wooden chair, placed a rifle against the wall, leaned back, and stared at the rising sun, letting its warmth reach his skin for the first time in days. He knew it was not over. He knew there would be more battles, more enemies, more wars dressed in new armor, with new names and new weapons. But now the galaxy remembered something it had tried to forget. Humanity does not fall quietly. Not while people like Rick Dalton still breathe. And in the deepest parts of space, where new enemies watched and planned and whispered of conquest, a new word began to echo across their ranks, carried in fear and spoken like a curse. Dalton.